When your most predictable neighbor stops answering your calls and starts building a new road to someone else's house, that's not diplomacy breaking down. That's a border being redrawn without moving an inch of dirt. This week, Ottawa made a move that Washington didn't see coming. And the panic isn't about politics. It's about what happens when the supply chain you took for granted suddenly has options you don't control. For more than 3 decades, the U.S. Canada trade relationship was the most stable economic border on the planet. Nearly $2 billion worth of goods crossed that line every single day. Canadian crude-fed refineries in the Midwest. American manufacturers treated Ontario and Quebec like extensions of Michigan and New York. The border wasn't a friction point. It was a conveyor belt. Washington never questioned it because Ottawa never gave them a reason to. The relationship was so embedded that policymakers stopped seeing it as a relationship at all. It became infrastructure, invisible, automatic, permanent, and in trade, the moment you stop watching something is the moment it starts to change. It didn't begin with a dramatic announcement at the G7 or a tense phone call between capitals. It began quietly in mid-December 2025 when Canada's Ministry of Transport issued an administrative approval for a new freight rail corridor extension linking Thunder Bay, Ontario, to a Chinese-financed transload hub near the port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia. The language was technical. The timing was not. Just weeks earlier, Washington had floated the possibility of implementing new cross-border tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum imports as part of a broader supply chain security review. Ottawa didn't respond with a press release. They responded with infrastructure. The rail extension wasn't labeled a retaliation. It was labeled an optimization. But in trade, optimization is just another word for exit strategy. And this one pointed west. Let's ground this. The Thunder Bay corridor cuts transit time for Canadian grain, potash, and timber exports to Asian markets by roughly 4 days compared to routing through Vancouver. Prince Rupert already handles approximately 1.4 million 20-foot equivalent container units annually and is now the closest major North American port to Shanghai. 2 days closer than Los Angeles. The hub's expansion, backed by nearly $3 billion in private and provincial financing, includes cold storage, bulk terminals, and direct intermodal links to the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway network. Meanwhile, American ports like Seattle and Tacoma have been fighting labor disputes and congestion since late 2024. Canadian exporters started noticing. So did buyers in South Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was measurable. By early January 2026, export volumes through Prince Rupert destined for Asia climbed roughly 14% compared to the previous quarter. Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago weren't on those manifests anymore. Neither was the assumption that Canada's export strategy had to flow south first. This was never just about a rail line. It was about the assumption that proximity equals dependency. Washington believed that because Canada shares a border with the United States, it would always prioritize access to American markets over alternatives. That assumption just became optional. And in geopolitics, the moment your leverage becomes optional is the moment you're no longer holding leverage. You're hoping for loyalty. Hope is not a strategy. The rail corridor wasn't a one-off. It was a visible piece of a broader recalibration. In late 2025, Ottawa signed a memorandum of understanding with Japan and South Korea to streamline regulatory approvals for Canadian liquefied natural gas exports to the Pacific coast. That same month, Canada's Export Development Corporation expanded its financing facilities for firms pivoting toward Asian buyers, offering credit guarantees that effectively subsidize the transition away from U.S.-dependent supply chains. Then came the legislative signal. In early January 2026, a bipartisan group of Canadian parliamentarians introduced a trade diversification bill aimed at reducing reliance on any single export destination to below 60% of total trade volume. The bill didn't name the United States. It didn't have to. The target was in the math, and the message was in the infrastructure already under construction. Step 1. Build the alternative before you announce the pivot. Ottawa approved the Thunder Bay-Prince Rupert corridor as an infrastructure modernization project, not a geopolitical signal. That kept it below the threshold of immediate U.S. scrutiny. By the time Washington realized what was being built, the contracts were signed and the grading had started. Step 2. Align with buyers who want diversification as much as you do. Japan and South Korea have been hunting for non-Chinese, non-American supply sources since the pandemic exposed the fragility of overconcentrated. Canadian energy and agricultural exports fit that demand perfectly. Ottawa didn't have to sell the idea. They just had to show up with capacity. Step 3. Use private capital to insulate from political blowback. The infrastructure financing for Prince Rupert came primarily from Canadian pension funds, provincial investment arms, and a Hong Kong-based logistics consortium. No federal budget line. No easy political target for Washington to lean on. The project became commercially justified before it became politically controversial. Step 4. Reroute incrementally, not dramatically. Canadian exporters didn't pull out of U.S. markets overnight. They started testing Pacific routes for non-critical shipments, grain, lumber, minerals. Once the logistics proved reliable and cost-competitive, the volumes grew. The shift looked like market optimization, not strategic betrayal. That made it harder for Washington to frame it as hostile without sounding paranoid. Step 5. Create redundancy that eliminates veto points. For decades, Canadian exports to Asia had to either route through congested U.S. West Coast ports or take longer sea routes. That gave Washington implicit leverage. Any disruption to cross-border rail or port access could choke Canadian trade. The Thunder Bay corridor removes that bottleneck. It gives Ottawa a path to global markets that doesn't require American cooperation, American infrastructure, or American goodwill. Independence isn't built with speeches. It's built with alternatives. Washington's first instinct was to slow this down through regulatory friction, environmental reviews, cross-border rail inspections, quiet pressure on logistics firms with U.S. exposure. But the infrastructure was being built entirely on Canadian soil, using Canadian and third-party financing. There was no federal permit to delay, no U.S. contractor to lean on, no joint commission to stall in. The White House floated the idea of conditioning future trade negotiations on limits to third-party logistics partnerships. Ottawa's response was polite and firm. Canada would continue to pursue trade diversification in the national interest. The veto point didn't exist. The leverage was rhetorical, not structural. And once the infrastructure goes live, rhetoric doesn't reroute freight. Let's translate this into American consequences. Midwest manufacturers rely on Canadian steel, aluminum, and component parts that cross the border daily on just-in-time schedules. If Canadian producers start prioritizing Asian buyers who pay in advance and don't threaten tariffs every election cycle, those inputs get harder to source or more expensive to secure. Automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio don't shut down overnight, but their margins tighten and their supply chains get fragile. Energy is the bigger exposure. Canadian crude accounts for more than half of U.S. oil imports. Refineries from Minnesota to Texas are calibrated for heavy Canadian crude. Switching suppliers means retooling or accepting lower yields. If Ottawa begins prioritizing LNG exports to Asia over oil exports to the U.S., those refineries face either rising costs or supply interruptions. That flows directly into gasoline prices at American pumps and diesel costs for American logistics networks. Then there's agriculture. Canada supplies roughly a quarter of the fresh vegetables consumed in the northern U.S. during winter months and is a critical supplier of potash fertilizer to American farms. If Canadian agriculture exporters start locking in long-term contracts with Asian buyers, American distributors and farmers face tighter supply and higher prices. This isn't a hypothetical. In early January 2026, U.S. fertilizer importers reported that Canadian suppliers were offering shorter contract windows and prioritizing export commitments to India and Brazil. The shift is already in motion. The broader danger is precedent. If Canada can successfully reduce dependency on U.S. markets without triggering economic collapse, other allied economies start asking the same question. Why are we negotiating from position of dependency when we could be building alternatives? Mexico watches. South Korea watches. Australia watches. The U.S. dollar and U.S. market access, the most durable forms of leverage for decades. That leverage begins to erode the moment your allies stop seeing access to your economy as irreplaceable. Washington's traditional tools lose their edge once alternatives are operational. Tariffs hurt less when your buyers are in Tokyo and Seoul instead of Detroit and Houston. Threats of market access restrictions lose credibility when your exporters are already pivoting toward markets you don't control. Diplomatic pressure softens when your neighbor has financing, infrastructure, and trade agreements that don't require your approval. Canada isn't declaring independence from U.S. trade. They're declaring optionality. And optionality is the quietest form of power. It doesn't require confrontation. It just requires that the next time Washington makes a demand, Ottawa can afford to say no. The rail line from Thunder Bay to Prince Rupert isn't a weapon. It's a veto, and once it's operational, it's permanent. Here's the deeper structure at work. Trade relationships aren't held together by sentiment. They're held together by the cost of alternatives. For 3 decades, the cost of Canada pivoting away from U.S. markets was prohibitively high. That cost just dropped. Infrastructure erodes leverage faster than any policy ever could. Proximity is not the same as dependency. Washington assumed that sharing a border meant Canada had no choice but to align with U.S. economic priorities. That assumption confused geography with strategy. Geography is fixed. Strategy is not. Allies don't leave loudly. They leave incrementally. There's no declaration, no summit breakdown, just a new rail line here, a financing facility there, a memorandum of understanding with a third party. By the time the shift is visible, it's already structural. The countries that win the next decade of trade wars won't be the ones with the loudest tariffs or the biggest threats. They'll be the ones that build alternatives while everyone else was talking. Infrastructure is ideology in physical form. And right now, Ottawa is building an ideology that doesn't require Washington's permission. Power in trade doesn't come from the ability to punish. It comes from the ability to walk away. Canada just built the exit. The most dangerous competitors aren't the ones who challenge you directly. They're the ones who stop needing you quietly. And once they stop needing you, they stop listening. So here's what Washington is waking up to. The neighbor you never worried about just built a highway that doesn't run through your territory. The trade relationship you treated as automatic is now conditional. The leverage you assumed was permanent is now negotiable. And the infrastructure that makes it all possible is already breaking ground. The irony is sharp. For years, U.S. policymakers talked about reducing dependency on China, diversifying supply chains, building resilient trade networks. They never imagined that their closest ally might apply the same logic to them. Canada didn't betray the United States. They just took Washington's own advice and pointed it in a different direction. The question that should haunt every strategist in Washington tonight is this. If your most stable ally is building an exit, what does that say about the value of the relationship you thought you controlled? And if they can afford to leave, who else is already drawing up the blueprints? If you want to keep tracking the moves that don't make headlines until they reshape the map, subscribe now. The infrastructure is already being built. The only question is whether you'll see it before it's finished.